Okay, what I want to talk about today is, climate change misinformation, also known as climate denial. And I want to make 3 points. I want to talk about the supply of climate misinformation. I want to talk about the demand side, why it is that people believe it. And then I briefly want to touch on possible solutions, but also the global geopolitical context in which we find ourselves in these interesting times. So, talking about the supply, the disinformers. Who are they? What are they doing? Now, a lot of research has been done on this. I can't cover all of it, but just very briefly, we know that there's a lot of money being spent around the world in engaging in what I call climate denial or the spread of climate disinformation. Here's one estimate by a sociologist, Robert Brolly, from some time ago, who pegged this figure at about $900 million a year for conservative think tanks that, among lots of other things, engaged in climate denial. And about $2 billion was spent lobbying Congress against climate change legislation during that time period in the pre-Trump era. So there's a lot of money being spent with a lot of success because so far we haven't seen any real American climate legislation. In Europe, it's not that different. It's all at a lower scale. But, it's nearly 100 million euros being spent per year lobbying the European Commission. And in comparison to that, Greenpeace is probably spending 100 euros a year trying to get one appointment with the Commission. So there's an incredible asymmetry there, and that network has been demonstrably successful. Here's one study by Justin Farrell done some time ago who looked at 4,500 individuals, 164 of these conservative think tanks in the United States, and then did a linguistic analysis of more than 40,000 documents, computationally. And what he then did was to look at the similarity between those contrarian texts and public output. And what you see here is a plot over time from 1995 through 2013, how much more similar did the rhetoric in the news media by presidents and on the floor of Congress, how much more similar did that become to denialist material? And as you can see, for the news media and American presidents, that similarity increased. Now, there are two possible reasons for this. One is that the contrarian think tanks came to their senses and sounded more like presidents along the way. The other possibility, and that's the one that actually happened, is that those contrarian think tanks didn't change their tune, but instead that the media and the president became more similar in their own rhetoric to these denialist organizations. So I think that is what's happening. And it is not just presidents and politicians who do funny things, it is also scientists. Now here's an analysis that is currently underway by one of my visiting PhD students, Garrett Anders, who's currently in Bristol and is doing some fantastic linguistic analyses, computational analyses of scientific text. And what he's done is to compare all the IPCC reports since the 1990s against, where available, something called the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, the NIPCC, which is the Heartland Institute, which is one of those think tanks I've been telling you about, and I can assure you that what's in this screed on the right is not science. It is pseudoscience. So, but how do these two sources of information differ over time and between each other with respect to one important dimension, and that is the extent to which they express certainty or uncertainty in their language. So what we did here was to use an established, validated dictionary that captures linguistic certainty or uncertainty. We applied it to all the text in the IPCC and the NIPCC, and this is what you find. Now the blue is the science, the orange is the pseudoscience. The pseudoscience is much more certain. They know what they're talking about. Oh, don't worry, climate change is a hoax. We're sure of it. Now what does the IPCC do? What do scientists do? Well, they learn more and more, they know more and more, 30 years of research, and so they become less certain. The uncertainty increases from one report to the next in the IPCC. Oh, yeah, we think, there is climate change, yeah, but oh, there's so much uncertainty. That is basically what is captured here. I'm caricaturing this, but the large-scale linguistic analysis is pretty clear that there's a decline in certainty in the language in the IPCC. Now, fine, that gives us some coarse understanding of the supply of climate denial. Now, I want to become more specific, and I want to sort of give you one example, at least, of how climate disinformers mislead, and how it differs from actual science. And that, I think, is really important, because when we call something denial, well, what is entitling us to use that term? Why isn't it just a computing knowledge claim, or what other postmodernist philosophers, my dear friends, what they might be willing to say? Well, all right, let's find out. Here's this is some time ago now, about 10 years. Somebody in the Telegraph in the United Kingdom, telling off the climate models, they all do. They haven't been to your talk, Andreas, so they say, ha, they got their predictions hopelessly wrong. And by the way, there was a fall in global temperature of 0.7 degrees, greater than the entire net rise in the 20th century. And when I read that, I thought, really? Here are the data. Now, on that scale, 0.7 degrees is precisely that amount. And I drew it precisely at the place where this claim was made of a 0.7 degree drop in temperature. And you wonder, what's going on here? Where is this coming from? Are these people just making stuff up? Well, yeah, sort of. But not quite. They're a little bit cleverer than that. What they do is they study the data really hard on a monthly basis. And then they find 2 points from 1 month to another month, a year later or whatever, where there is a drop of 0.7 degrees, right? Technically that's true, but of course it's entirely misleading, because who cares? The trend is, of course, overwhelming these natural fluctuations. All right, now that's me saying it's ridiculous, but why would you believe me? I'm an activist and woke and left-wing, and whatever the internet tells you is probably true. So we should do better than that. So what we did, this is some time ago, was to take scenarios of actual claims made by climate deniers, but we then converted them into other domains to take out all the politics and the emotion. So here is a claim made by a climate blogger. It says here our country's rural population is growing, not shrinking. Almost all of the rural regions are gaining population. And that's the claim. Here are the actual data about rural population growth. So it says, but of course it isn't. What do you think this is? Any guesses? Especially in Switzerland. You should. It's glaciers. It's the mass balance of glaciers over time. But we dressed it up as this population thing. And we then asked experts, statisticians and economists, to tell us whether the claim made about the data was justified or not. And we had a bunch of items, put them all together into a single score, and here are the results for our statisticians. Ignore everything to the left here that's detail. The important thing are the solid, thick bars on the right. And what that tells us that everything in our set that the deniers were saying was judged to be incorrect, whereas the mainstream science, I didn't tell you that, but we had them in there as well, the dark gray bars was judged to be correct. In other words, in a blind test, climate science is vindicated, denial is identified as denial. So it's not just me, it is a blind test of two groups of experts confirming how the misleading is being done, namely through cherry picking. Now, what are the effects of this on the public? Here's a very recent paper by colleagues of mine in Australia, where they misinformed participants about the bushfires in Australia, which, according to the Murdoch media, were caused by arson. In fact, they were not. But the moment you tell people that, then as you can see in the red bar, their reasoning about bushfires becomes much more in line with the misinformation, and no longer with anything having to do with climate change. This campaign about arson was extremely effective. And when you then ask people, hey, what would happen in the future? Then you get the same effect of misinformation. People are reasoning more about arson and less about climate change. And this is now what's really important. When you ask them about floods, they do the same thing. It's a tiny effect. But even when you ask them about future floods, they're no longer talking as much about climate change in their reasoning as they are about other causes that have nothing to do with climate change. So this matters, the misinformation. Now the other good news you may have noticed are the blue bars in here, which show that if you correct this, then people don't fall for the misinformation. So we're not powerless, but we're in a situation where the public is denied the right to be informed about the risks it's facing because of the supply of climate science denial. All right, why would anybody buy this stuff? Who are the consumers? Well, this graph tells the whole story, even though it's just one data set. But there's been about 100 of these at least. And that is that the more people are embracing free markets, the more libertarian they are, the more conservative they are, the less likely they are to accept climate change. Now, not everybody who's conservative is in that camp, of course not. It's a statistical relationship. But that is how strong it is. And it doesn't really matter how you measure politics. You can have binary indicators, such as party membership in the United States. You can use all these other scales that are, different subtleties. It doesn't matter. And it holds across at least 24 countries, and it's been replicated numerous times. So this is one of those stable findings out there, and it's really not subject to rational, empirical debate. So why? What is it about conservatism that predisposes people to reject science? Well, I want to flip this around, and I want to say, well, what is it about science that makes it so hard for conservatives? What has science done? Well, actually, if you look at what science has done, it's challenging. Because in the Middle Ages, we were the crown of creation at the center of the universe. And now, 500 years later, we're just kind of, on a third rock from a very average star in a completely average galaxy. We are no longer the center of the universe. And frankly, I think that is a challenging idea to many people. And we know that this belief of humans being special is very closely tied to many religions and also conservatism. And science, of course, is knocking that every day. There's more that tells us we're not so special. And it's worse than that, because if you look at the norms of science and you analyze what scientists actually do and what they think and what their ideology is, then you find that their norms, communism, don't really sound terribly conservative. Scientific knowledge transcends boundaries, borders. Scientific knowledge belongs to everybody, usually or often. And if you ask scientists about these norms, then yeah, they will agree with that by and large. Or they certainly used to. I don't know what's happened in the last 5 years, but everybody's an entrepreneur now. But there used to be a time when this was accepted. So those norms, they're not, compatible with conservatism, not straight up. That doesn't mean a conservative cannot be a scientist. I'm not saying that at all. But I do think there might be a tension there that is worth exploring. So let me show you some data from a bunch of studies we published a few years ago, where Klaus Oberauer at the University of Zurich and I studied these different constructs and how they relate to people's endorsement of scientific facts on the right. Now I'm going to focus on study 2, where we looked at conservatism, the norms of science directly, and we linked that to people's beliefs about scientific findings. Now, this is a big table, so I'm going to walk you through it step by step. It's actually not that complicated because it's quite straightforward. First of all, there's a moderate positive association between people's endorsement of climate science and their endorsement of vaccines, the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Now, we know this from before, that if a person accepts one scientific finding, they're more likely to also accept others, and vice versa. Most anti-vaxxers are climate deniers, and vice versa, statistically speaking. That's what we show here. We also show that endorsement of the norms of science is related to acceptance of these scientific notions, both climate and vaccinations. Not entirely surprising, but in a sense gratifying to know that the people who absorb those norms or accept them also accept the outcome of the scientific enterprise. We also show, yet again, that the political variables ignore the social dominance. It's another way of testing conservatism almost. Look at the negative numbers. As before, the more conservative people are, the less likely they are to accept climate change and vaccination. But now here's the final result. That was the whole point of running the study. We looked at people's political orientations and examined how they related to acceptance of the norms of science. What you can see there is quite strong negative correlations. The more conservative or the more hierarchical people are, the less likely they are to accept the norms of science. They say, no, 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 that's not for me. Now, this may reflect that fundamental tension between the scientific enterprise and conservative worldviews. Now, that's again not to say that every conservative is like that, not at all, but statistically, There is this association, and it may be quite fundamental. And I want to leave you with that possibility rather than saying, oh, that's the way it is. Which brings me to our last point. Now what? What are we going to do? Well, here's a thought experiment. I'm assuming you like oysters. If you do, then this is an interesting question. Would you eat these particular oysters if it were the case that 97 out of 100 microbiologists recommend against eating them because they're contaminated? Would you eat those oysters? Well, I wouldn't. Even if there are 2 out of 100 that are unsure, and there's one who says they're safe. But the 97 others say, not so good. Well, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't eat those oysters. Now, those numbers weren't arbitrarily chosen because there's a lot of evidence that at least 97% of climate scientists, and by now I think that number has increased probably to 99% or so, agree on these 3 fundamental premises of climate change. Now that is a scientific consensus. And if you know nothing else, if you're a member of the public, then deference to the scientific consensus can be epistemically or philosophically justified under certain circumstances listed here. So that it isn't just, people saying to each other, oh, yeah, let's all say the same thing. No, it has to be the result of independent scientific examinations. There has to be consilience, social diversity, and so on and so on. And as everybody in this room knows, those conditions are met when it comes to climate science. Because there's many independent lines of evidence, many independent institutions, all agreeing that this is the case. So, can you use this as a communication tool? I would say yes. The answer is, it can be done, it should be done, and it works. Here's an early study from my own lab, quite some time ago now, but it was the first one to show that if you provide people with consensus information, their acceptance of climate change increases, and it does so particularly for people on the right here who would be most disinclined to believe it to begin with. Now that has been replicated many, many times, and there was a recent mega study with, I think, 27,000 participants across 27 countries that showed, yes, if you present people with consensus information, they become more willing or more, increase their acceptance of climate change. And again, particularly people with right-leaning ideology. Now let me sum up and then pivot a little bit to the geopolitics I promised. The points I've been making is that the public is being denied the right to be informed about the risks it's facing. And that is because we live in an adversarial environment. And any communication we as scientists do is going to be met with rejection and counter-argumentation. So, consensus messaging is great, but it can only take us so far. In particular, because we're living through, it seems to me, a decade of history kind of every week. You wake up on Monday morning, you figure, what's he done now? And then Iran, right? Or something else, Greenland, whatever, you name it. Now, if you quantify the backsliding, that democratic backsliding that's occurring in the United States, and you left justify it to the same time of origin as in other countries that were losing their democracy, then you find that the US is declining far more steeply. Now Hungary hopefully will suffer an uptick from here on, but for the US, very unclear it's going to happen. And this isn't just an abstract consideration. Here are quantitative data about academic freedom, again expressed as years after the onset of an episode of backsliding. And look at how the US has declined incredibly steeply. And we are now in a space where climate science is shrinking and NCAR is being abolished. So that is the geopolitical context. And I want to conclude by drawing your attention to some resources that my team and I have published, including one recently that pertains to the last two slides, an anti-autocracy handbook for researchers under democratic backsliding. All of this you can find at that QR code. And with that, I thank you for your attention.